Welcome to Relation Tales. Please like this video and subscribe Relation Tales. James grew up in a small town where life was simple and predictable. His father was a factory worker, and his mother stayed home to take care of James and his two younger sisters. His parents had a solid marriage, or so it seemed to James growing up. There were no grand gestures of affection, no lavish vacations or displays of romance. But what James saw was dependability. His father came home every night after work, exhausted but always on time for dinner. His mother, although tired from looking after the house and children, never complained. They were a team, working together in unspoken understanding to build a stable life for their family. In their world, love wasn't about passion or excitement. It was about consistency and duty. This is what James grew up believing. His father's words echoed in his mind throughout his life. A man's job is to provide. If you do that, everything else will fall into place. James took these lessons to heart. When he was 18, he left home for college, determined to make something of himself. He studied finance, knowing that a career in this field would give him the stability his father had always valued. During his years at college, James worked part-time jobs, saved every penny he could, and never let himself get distracted by the parties or wild college life. He had a plan, and nothing would derail him. After graduation, James quickly landed a job at a financial firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a solid start. He worked long hours, sometimes 60 to 70 hours a week, determined to climb the ladder and provide a better life for himself and his future family. It was during this time that he met Sarah. Sarah's upbringing was the opposite of James. She was raised in a bustling city by parents who were adventurous and spontaneous. Her mother was a freelance photographer, and her father a musician. Their home was filled with laughter, music, and impromptu parties. Sarah loved the vibrancy of it all. The late-night conversations, the eclectic group of friends who would stop by unannounced, the trips her family would take on a whim. Her parents' relationship was passionate, but tumultuous. They loved hard and fought even harder. There were times when they would argue for days, only to make up with grand romantic gestures. It wasn't uncommon for Sarah to wake up to the sound of her parents yelling one day, and then see them slow dancing in the living room the next night. This was what Sarah believed love was supposed to be, a whirlwind of passion, excitement, and unpredictability. When Sarah went to college, she took that belief with her. She was the life of the party, always surrounded by friends, always seeking the next adventure. Relationships came and went quickly for Sarah. She enjoyed the excitement of new romances but struggled to maintain them once the initial thrill wore off. It wasn't until she met James that she considered settling down. James was different from the guys she usually dated. He was stable, dependable, and calm. At first, it was a refreshing change. Sarah had grown tired of the wild ups and downs of her previous relationships. James offered her something she hadn't experienced before: security. They fell in love, got married, and moved into a quiet suburban home. But over time, Sarah began to feel restless. The life she had chosen with James was comfortable, but it lacked the passion she had always craved. By their 7th year of marriage, James and Sarah had fallen into a predictable routine. James would leave for work early in the morning, often before Sarah even woke up. He would be gone for most of the day, sometimes not returning until late in the evening. When he did come home, he was exhausted. He would kiss Sarah on the cheek, ask her how her day was, and then retreat to his study to catch up on emails or prepare for the next day's meetings. Their conversations were brief and perfunctory, revolving around logistics, what groceries they needed, what bills were due, and whether they had any plans for the weekend. They rarely talked about their feelings anymore. When they did, it was usually Sarah trying to express her frustration with how distant James had become. But James would brush it off, telling her he was just busy with work, that he was doing everything he could to provide for them. To James, the problem was simple. He worked hard to ensure they had a good life. He paid the bills, kept a roof over their heads, and made sure they were financially secure. What more could Sarah want? He didn't understand that what Sarah needed wasn't money or security, but attention, affection, and emotional intimacy. Sarah, on the other hand, felt like she was slowly suffocating in their marriage. The man she had fallen in love with seemed to be slipping away from her, replaced by someone who was always too busy, too tired, or too distracted. She tried to talk to him about it, but each time she was met with the same response: "I'm doing this for us." When Sarah received the invitation to her old college friend's party, she felt a flicker of excitement she hadn't felt in years. It was like a breath of fresh air in her otherwise suffocating life. She hadn't seen her college friends in a long time, and the thought of reconnecting with them made her nostalgic for the days when life was carefree and full of excitement. She spent extra time getting ready for the party, choosing a dress that made her feel young and vibrant. As she applied her makeup, she found herself wondering if James would even notice the effort she was putting in. When she mentioned the party to him earlier that week, he had barely looked up from his laptop, simply muttering, "Have fun." James wasn't going, of course. He was too busy with work, as usual. Part of Sarah was disappointed, but another part of her was relieved. She didn't want to bring the tension of their marriage to the party. She wanted to enjoy herself, to feel like her old self again, free and full of life. The party was held at a trendy loft downtown. The moment Sarah walked in, she was hit with a wave of nostalgia. The laughter, the music, the familiar faces, it was like stepping back into her college years. She greeted her friends, catching up on their lives, and for the first time in a long time, she felt genuinely happy. And then she saw him, Michael. Michael had been the charming, confident guy in college who everyone gravitated toward. He was the kind of person who could light up a room just by walking into it. Sarah hadn't seen him in years, but he looked just as handsome as she remembered. When their eyes met, her heart skipped a beat. They spent most of the evening talking, catching up on each other's lives. Michael had become a successful entrepreneur, traveling the world and living a life full of excitement. He listened intently as Sarah talked about her life, nodding sympathetically when she mentioned how busy James was and how lonely she often felt. As the night went on, the conversation became more flirtatious. Michael complimented Sarah on how great she looked, how he couldn't believe she was married, and how lucky James was to have her. Sarah blushed, feeling a rush of excitement that she hadn't felt in years. When the party started to wind down, instead of going home, Sarah and Michael decided to grab a drink at a nearby bar. They talked for hours, reminiscing about their college days, laughing about old memories and sharing stories about their lives. By the end of the night, Sarah felt a connection with Michael that she hadn't felt with James in a long time. When Michael asked for her number, Sarah hesitated for only a moment before giving it to him. As she drove home that night, her mind raced with thoughts of Michael. The excitement, the connection, the attention, it was everything she had been missing in her marriage. And for the first time in a long time, she felt alive. The days following the party were a blur of excitement and anxiety for Sarah. She found herself constantly checking her phone, waiting for a message from Michael. The initial excitement of seeing him again had been exhilarating, but now that she was back in the reality of her marriage with James, a sense of guilt began creeping in. She knew deep down that giving Michael her number had been a mistake, but there was a part of her that couldn't resist the pull toward him. Michael texted her the very next day. "Last night was fun. Great seeing you again. Let's catch up soon." Sarah stared at the message for a few moments, her heart racing. She could hear James in the other room, typing away on his laptop. She felt a pang of guilt, but she quickly pushed it aside and typed back, "Yeah, it was nice seeing you too. What harm could there be in a few texts?" She wasn't doing anything wrong, she told herself. It wasn't like she was cheating. They were just old friends reconnecting, after all. But as the days passed, their conversations became more frequent, and the tone of the messages began to shift. What started as friendly banter quickly turned into something more intimate. Michael was charming, attentive, and always knew exactly what to say to make Sarah feel special. He would send her compliments, telling her how beautiful she looked in the photos she posted on social media, how lucky James was to have her, and how much he had missed her over the years. Sarah, who had been starved for attention and affection, soaked it all in. Soon, they were texting each other throughout the day, when James was at work, when Sarah was alone at home, and sometimes even when James was sitting right next to her on the couch. She found herself becoming more and more engrossed in the conversations with Michael, feeling a sense of excitement and passion that had long been missing from her marriage. As the weeks went by, Sarah and Michael's conversations became increasingly flirtatious. They began reminiscing about their college days, about the times they spent together before life had taken them in different directions. Michael often mentioned how he had always thought Sarah was special, how he had always admired her confidence and beauty. Sarah, who had grown used to being invisible in her own home, was drawn to Michael's attention like a moth to a flame. It wasn't long before they started discussing more personal, intimate details of their lives. Sarah opened up to Michael about her struggles with James, about how disconnected she felt in her marriage. She confided in him about her loneliness, about how she often felt like she was living with a stranger. Michael listened, offering sympathy and understanding, making Sarah feel heard and valued in a way she hadn't felt in years. Michael, in turn, shared stories about his own romantic struggles. He had never married, preferring the freedom of his bachelor lifestyle, but he admitted that he sometimes felt lonely too. He told Sarah that he had always wondered what might have happened if they had stayed in touch after college, if maybe they had taken a different path together. His words sent a thrill through Sarah, making her wonder the same thing. The first time Sarah and Michael met in person after the party, it was under the pretense of catching up as friends. They met at a quiet cafe on the other side of town, far enough from home that Sarah didn't have to worry about running into anyone she knew. As she walked into the cafe, her heart pounded in her chest. She knew she was playing with fire, but the excitement of seeing Michael again was too tempting to resist. Michael greeted her with a warm smile, and as they sat down to talk, the connection between them was palpable. They talked for hours, laughing and reminiscing, and Sarah felt herself being pulled deeper into the web of their affair. By the time they parted ways, Sarah's mind was spinning. She knew that she should stop, that she should cut off contact with Michael before things went too far. But she didn't. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and Michael met several more times. Each meeting was filled with a mixture of excitement and guilt for Sarah. She knew she was crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed, but every time she was with Michael, she felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. The passion and intensity of their connection was intoxicating, and Sarah found herself making excuses to leave the house more often, just to be with him. James, meanwhile, began to notice the changes in Sarah's behavior. At first, it was small things. Sarah spending more time on her phone, going out more often without telling him where she was going. When he asked her about it, she would brush him off with vague answers, telling him she was meeting a friend or running errands. James, always trusting of Sarah, didn't push the issue at first. He assumed she was just busy or stressed. But as time went on, the signs became harder to ignore. Sarah started coming home later and later, and when James asked her about it, she would snap at him, telling him he was being paranoid. She seemed more distant, avoiding him whenever he tried to engage her in conversation. James, who had always believed in the strength of their marriage, began to feel a gnawing sense of unease. One evening, while Sarah was in the shower, James decided to check her phone. It wasn't something he had ever done before. He had always trusted Sarah completely, but something inside him told him that he needed to know the truth. As he scrolled through her messages, his heart sank. There, in plain sight, were the messages between Sarah and Michael. Flirtatious texts, intimate conversations, plans to meet up. It was all there. James felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under him. He couldn't believe what he was reading. The woman he had loved and trusted for years had been lying to him, deceiving him, and now he had the proof right in front of him. James sat on the edge of the bed, staring at Sarah's phone in disbelief. The messages between her and Michael were a knife to his heart, each one cutting deeper than the last. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him as he tried to process the betrayal. How long had this been going on? How could Sarah have done this to him? When Sarah came out of the shower, she immediately sensed that something was wrong. James was sitting there, his face pale, his eyes hard. She felt a chill run down her spine as she saw her phone in his hand. "What's this, Sarah?" James asked, his voice low but filled with pain. "What is this?" Sarah's heart raced as she realized what was happening. She had been so careful, so sure that she could keep her affair with Michael a secret. But now it was all falling apart. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. "James, don't lie to me. James interrupted, his voice trembling with anger. "I've seen the messages. I know everything. How long has this been going on? How long have you been lying to me?" Sarah felt the weight of her guilt crash down on her like a tidal wave. She had been caught, and there was no escaping the truth now. Tears filled her eyes as she tried to explain herself, but there was nothing she could say that would make it right. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It just happened." James shook his head, his expression one of disbelief. "You didn't mean for it to happen? Sarah, you've been lying to me for months. You've been sneaking around, meeting with this guy behind my back. How could you do this to me? To us?" "I don't know," Sarah sobbed, tears streaming down her face. "I was lonely, James. You've been so distant, and I just needed someone to talk to. I never meant to hurt you." James stood up, pacing the room as he tried to process what she was saying. "So, this is my fault now? Because I've been working to provide for us? Because I've been busy trying to make sure we have a good life? That's your excuse?" Sarah shook her head, feeling the weight of her guilt crushing her. "No, it's not your fault. I'm not saying that. I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry, James. Please, just give me a chance to make it right." James turned to face her, his expression cold and distant. "Make it right? How do you expect to make this right? Sarah, you've betrayed me. You've destroyed everything we had. There's no coming back from this." The days following the confrontation were tense and filled with an icy silence. Sarah had begged James for forgiveness, but he had refused to engage with her any further. He withdrew into himself, cutting her off emotionally and physically. To Sarah, this coldness was worse than any angry outburst could have been. She wanted him to yell, to scream, to release the hurt he was feeling, but instead he gave her nothing. He simply became distant, like a stranger sharing the same house. James' quiet revenge was deliberate. He didn't need to destroy Sarah with harsh words or violent actions. His revenge was in his detachment, in his refusal to acknowledge her anymore. Every morning, he would get up, get dressed, and go to work without a word. He wouldn't even look at her. Sarah felt invisible, as if she no longer existed in his world. It was a cold, calculated punishment, and it was devastating. When Sarah tried to talk to him, to explain herself, he would simply walk away. If she cried, he wouldn't offer comfort. If she apologized, he wouldn't respond. It was as if Sarah's existence had ceased to matter to him. And in a way, it had. Behind the scenes, James began the process of filing for divorce. He hired a lawyer, gathered all the evidence he needed, and prepared for the legal battle that would come. But he didn't tell Sarah. He wanted her to suffer in the uncertainty, to feel the weight of her actions pressing down on her every day. He wanted her to live with the knowledge that she had destroyed their marriage and that there was no going back. The silence in the house became suffocating for Sarah. James no longer acknowledged her presence. He would come and go without a word, without even a glance in her direction. Each day, the atmosphere in their home grew colder, as if James had drained all the warmth from their lives. Sarah was left alone with her guilt, the weight of her actions pressing down on her more heavily than she could bear. She tried to reach out to her friends, but even they seemed to sense that something was wrong. The few close friends she had confided in before had distanced themselves, either out of discomfort or judgment. They didn't understand why she had risked her marriage, why she had turned her back on James for someone like Michael. In truth, Sarah didn't understand it either, at least not anymore. As for Michael, he began to fade from her life just as quickly as he had entered it. Their affair had been exciting, filled with passion and spontaneity, but now that the consequences were becoming real, Michael started to pull away. He had never intended to be a part of Sarah's life in a permanent way. For him, the affair was a thrill, a way to break the monotony of his own existence. But as soon as things became complicated, as soon as Sarah needed him emotionally, he disappeared. Sarah tried calling him several times after her confrontation with James, but Michael's responses became shorter, less frequent. When she finally asked if they could meet, he made up excuses, telling her he was busy with work or out of town. Deep down, Sarah knew that Michael had moved on. He had no intention of being a part of the mess she had created. For the first time since the affair began, Sarah was truly alone. The house felt empty without James' warmth, And without Michael's attention, Sarah felt adrift. She had risked everything for a fleeting sense of excitement, and now she had nothing to show for it. The reality of her situation hit her hard. She had destroyed her marriage, pushed away her friends, and now even Michael was gone. Sarah spent her days replaying the events in her mind, wondering how things had gone so wrong. She had once believed that Michael was the answer to her problems, that he would fill the void James had left in her life. But now she realized that the void was still there, larger than ever. The thrill of the affair had been temporary, and now all that remained was emptiness and regret. She began to reflect on her marriage with James, seeing it with new clarity. James had never been perfect. He had his flaws, and he had neglected her emotionally, but he had always been loyal, kind, and committed to building a life together. The stability that had once seemed suffocating now felt like something she had taken for granted. In the quiet moments of the day, when James was at work and the house was eerily still, Sarah would sit in the living room, staring at the walls, trying to understand how she had let things get so out of control. She had believed that she wanted passion, excitement, and spontaneity. But now she realized that what she had truly wanted was connection, something deeper and more meaningful than fleeting passion. But it was too late for those realizations now. The damage had been done, and there was no going back. While Sarah spiraled into guilt and regret, James focused on rebuilding his life. The initial shock of the betrayal had left him shattered, but as time passed, his anger began to fade, replaced by a cold determination to move forward. He didn't want to be the man who held on to bitterness. He had always been strong, steady, and he wasn't going to let Sarah's actions define the rest of his life. After filing for divorce, James moved in with his parents temporarily. They were supportive, though his mother's concern was palpable. She could see the pain in his eyes, even though James tried to hide it. His father, a man of few words, simply patted him on the back and told him he was doing the right thing. "Sometimes, you've got to let things go, son," his father said one evening. "No use holding on to something that's already broken." At first, James threw himself into his work, using it as a distraction from the emotional turmoil. He started staying even later at the office, working on projects that weren't even urgent just to keep his mind occupied. But eventually, he realized that burying himself in work wasn't the solution. It wasn't going to heal the wounds Sarah had left. He began spending more time with friends, reconnecting with people he hadn't seen in a while. They were understanding, offering their support without prying too much into the details of what had happened. Slowly, James started to open up, sharing bits and pieces of his story. And in doing so, he found a sense of release. His friends encouraged him to get out of the house more, to do things that made him happy. At first, it felt forced, going out to dinners, joining friends for drinks, even taking a weekend trip to the coast. But over time, James found that these small moments of normalcy were exactly what he needed. One weekend, he decided to take up running again, something he had loved in his younger years, but had let go of once he got caught up in the demands of work and marriage. Running became a form of therapy for James. Each morning, as he laced up his shoes and hit the pavement, he felt a sense of freedom. The rhythm of his feet against the ground, the fresh air filling his lungs, it all gave him a sense of control that he hadn't felt in months. As the weeks turned into months, James began to feel more like himself again. He realized that his life wasn't over just because his marriage had ended. In fact, in many ways, it felt like a new beginning. He had the chance to rediscover who he was outside of his relationship with Sarah, to pursue the things that brought him joy and fulfillment. One day, while sitting in a cafe with a friend, James looked around at the people walking by, at the couples laughing together, at the families enjoying their afternoon. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel a pang of sadness or anger. He felt at peace. His divorce from Sarah was finalized a few months later. The process was relatively smooth. James had made sure of that by staying emotionally detached throughout the proceedings. When the papers were signed, he felt a strange sense of relief. The chapter with Sarah was officially closed. But James knew that healing was a process, not a destination. He wasn't going to rush into anything new. For now, he was content with the idea of focusing on himself, on rebuilding his life, on healing the parts of him that had been broken. And that, for him, was enough. While James was finding solace in his new beginning, Sarah was drowning in regret. The loneliness in the house became unbearable after he moved out. The walls echoed with memories of their life together, and everywhere she turned, she was reminded of what she had lost. The photos of their happier times, the furniture they had chosen together, even the scent of James' cologne that still lingered in the closet, it all felt like a cruel reminder of the life she had destroyed. Sarah had thought that she wanted freedom, excitement, passion. But now that she had it, she realized it wasn't what she needed at all. She needed stability, love, and trust, things she had taken for granted with James. She had been so focused on what she felt was missing that she hadn't appreciated what she had. Michael had long since disappeared from her life. The affair that had once seemed so thrilling now felt like a distant, painful memory. The excitement had faded, and in its place was a deep, gnawing sense of shame. She had betrayed the man who had loved her, the man who had built a life with her, for something that had never been real. There were nights when Sarah would lie awake in bed, staring at the empty space beside her, wondering if James was doing the same. She thought about texting him, calling him, begging for another chance. But she knew it was futile. James had made it clear that there was no going back. The divorce had been finalized, and with it, any hope of reconciliation had vanished. Sarah was left with an empty house, an empty life, and an overwhelming sense of regret. She had no one to blame but herself. In her darker moments, Sarah would think back to the early days of her marriage, when everything had seemed so perfect. She remembered the way James used to look at her, the way he would surprise her with small acts of kindness, the way they used to talk for hours about their dreams and plans for the future. She had taken all of it for granted, believing that there would always be more time, more chances to fix things. But now it was too late. The story of James and Sarah is one of love lost, of choices made, and of consequences faced. Both had entered their marriage with hopes, dreams, and expectations. But somewhere along the way, they lost sight of what truly mattered: connection, communication, and trust. James, in his quest to provide stability, had neglected the emotional needs of his marriage. He had believed that hard work and dedication to his career would be enough to keep their relationship strong. But in doing so, he had left Sarah feeling unseen and unloved. Sarah, in her search for excitement and passion, had made choices that ultimately destroyed her marriage. She had believed that an affair would fill the void she felt in her life, but instead, it left her with nothing but regret. In the end, both James and Sarah had to come to terms with the consequences of their actions. For James, the betrayal was painful, but it also led to personal growth and a new beginning. For Sarah, the affair that had once seemed so thrilling became the greatest mistake of her life, one that she would carry with her forever. The house that had once been their home now stood empty, a symbol of the life they had built together and the choices that had torn it apart. And as James moved forward, ready to embrace his new chapter, Sarah was left with the weight of her regrets, knowing that she had let something precious slip through her fingers.